Hi, I'm Diane Ellor, and today we're going to be going through a watercolor lesson working on cherry blossoms. I've been teaching at Reston Community Center for about 2 years, and I'm looking forward to working you through this lesson. Now, I have some reference information here in front of me, which is a good way to start. 2 paintings that I've done previously, and a photograph, which I have up on my computer monitor. I love working from my own photos as opposed to other people's photos because for me it allows a lot more creativity and allows me to really understand why I'm interested in an image. So I chose this particular image that we see because it's got a lovely lot of soft, bright, white, pink cherry blossoms, and that's going to give us a nice value change. And the background of the woods that you see behind it is not yet green. There's just a tiny bit of green. You're seeing a lot of amazing reds of buds beginning to open. So I thought it captures that unique moment in time when the blossoms really are out. Now, as I start, I love to come into the painting somewhere interesting that really lets me feel as though I'm in this setting and looking at these cherry blossoms. So I've come in, following my eye across the field. Now I come up the trunk to capture that closest tree. And as I capture those blossoms, I really just want to gently sketch that in because there's a beautiful edge on these blossoms, these masses of blossoms that I think is so interesting. I'm using just a little bit light touch of French ultramarine as I capture the top of the blossoms here and move across to capture the rest. And this is light enough to give me an idea of how I want to paint this without having to overly commit. Now we're going to finish up that shape of the blossoms. Again, we're capturing big shapes. We're always just going to work big shape to small shape. Underneath the tree, we have a little bit of road and we have a little bit of fence. I'm not thinking that much in terms of what these things are right now, but in terms of just defining these shapes. So we've got a light shape running here under the trees, running almost here to this particular tree. And then we're going to capture that bottom of there. And then here's the rest of our shape of the grass. Now behind these cherry trees, we're not going to do a whole lot of work, but we do want to suggest some of the forest that's there. And that's actually quite dark. So I'm going to just sketch in some of those shapes. We can leave them kind of very nice and sketchy, but we do want to know that they're here, and it is a good opportunity to use that tip of the brush to begin getting a little texture in there so that when we come back later to fill that in, we've already got a lot of that painting in place. I'm going to begin to lay in some color. Now when I paint, I really do like to work in the classic way of light to dark. So I am going to work on the lightest area first. When I'm outside, inside, even if I'm looking at a rose in a vase, I squint because then I can really see those big shapes and values. And I can see that my lightest areas are the blossoms, and then a little bit of sky up here in the left-hand corner. For the blossoms, I'm going to push it just a tiny, tiny bit pink, and I'm going to add to that, just in one section, a little bit of cerulean blue. Now, what I'm going to do to keep the color nice and light is I'm going to put in a lot of water, and I'm going to reach into my water quite a bit as I lay down some of this color. So I'm going to just come across some of these areas of the trees. Now I really want to just be very light as I do this, and I want to keep my brush moving. Because I love the idea of trying to capture that feeling that we have these beautiful blossoms, and they're very light. They're not solid things. They have some little bits on the edges. Now, watercolor does generally dry a little bit lighter than what you might see. Let's reach in, let's grab a little bit of that cerulean blue and just put it in a few spots. And I actually see a good piece of cerulean blue right in here. If I just put that in and let it move with my brush, getting a little bit of warmth in that area as well with a bit of orange, and I keep my brush moving, I can begin to get that lightness in. Now, as I look, I see there are a couple of areas within the tree that are a bit darker and a little bit bluer again. So I'm going to put that blue in here. Again, it's just the cerulean blue, that blue in here and in here. And if you notice, as I move my brush, I'm moving it such that it's coming out from the tree trunks as I'm putting this blue in. And that's because I want to capture that movement. Okay, and a little bit of the blue up in here. And we'll bring a little bit down in there. So that gives us a really nice start. Now, I always like to keep some color moving around the page. So let's put a little bit of this pink up in here and here, because if you look at the reference photo, you'll see that the buds in the trees are quite pink, and we'll work with that a little bit more later. Now, I also have a very light piece of sky, and we think of sky as blue, and it is, but as a painter, we also have to make a decision. What's our most important part of the painting? As I look at my reference photo, I see that it's really going to be these trees, and I see that the sky in the photo is quite light. I'm going to introduce some of the French ultramarine blue, just to give a little variety in that sky. And I'm keeping it still very light. Let's just bring a little sky across like this. You see, I'm not over planning this, but just really trying to lay in color to get a start of the painting. Now, I'm going to soften some of these edges here. This is going to end up being forest. And we have some light greens in here. So I'm going to start putting in a little bit of that light green here. So I'm going to mix a green. I'm going to start out with my cadmium yellow, which is my sort of lightest, brightest, truest yellow. And I'm using that because these spring greens are really quite light and bright. Let's pull just a little bit of that cobalt, that French ultramarine blue, a little mix. Then I'm going to pull a little bit more of the green over here. So I get myself a bit of a range here. I'm going to put this green in underneath the tree where I can see some of the green of the little plants that are there. Pull a little bit on this side of the tree as well. Then I'm going to reach and get a little more. And I see some green over here. Now again, I'm still keeping it's a super light painting. It's a start, which lets us really begin to think about how we want this to proceed. This area is going to go much darker, and as is this. I'm going to add a little more variety to that green. By reaching in, I'm going to grab a little tiny bit of hooker's green. I'm going to drop that in, just to start building a little variety. We are going to come back to that area, but I think the earlier in the process of the painting that you can build some variety, I think it's an excellent thing to do. Now, I'm going to now move to painting another light area, which is in the foreground. And the foreground is also quite green. It's quite light. It's a little bit of a less yellowy green. So I'm going to take my green that I've already mixed, and I'm going to add in a little bit more of this cobalt blue, this French ultramarine, and I'm going to pull in some of this hooker's green. Let's lighten it up a little more with the yellow. Now you notice when I mix my colors, I try not to over mix. As you look at the palette, you can see that I have a pool of more yellow here, bluer here, greener here. I want even more of that yellow, more of that bright green, that green that would be too bright on its own. Having a pool of color like this gives me a lot of options as I paint. I'm going to do another thing as well. I'm going to reach for a bigger brush. This will let me lay in this large area a little more easily. As I come here, I can begin to lay in that color using what I've mixed and moving my brush through these areas here. Now, as I do this, I really do like leaving a little bit of a striation in the color, because if you're going to look at a lawn or a field, you're going to see sort of this movement across of color. And I'm also going to dull this a little bit. I'm going to pull in some of the raw sienna. Just to give, again, a little bit more variety. Now, while I'm at this, I'm going to see if I can pull in a little bit of texture. One thing I do with that is I can do a little bit of scratching, and then I will come back later, drop a little bit of texture here. Having a little bit of a line here to pull the viewer in the painting with a little texture just helps to lead the eye to the tree, which gives us a nice balance right there. Now there's a darker bit under the tree of green, so let's darken that up. We'll pull in some of this raw sienna, some of the hooker's green, French ultramarine. We're going to lay in that darker bit of grass where we have a shadow. While we lay it in, even though we're working very loosely right now, can take advantage of the wet paint just to try to continue to build texture. Since it is wet, we're going to lose some of that texture as we move through this, and that's actually fine. And working with watercolor is very much of a push-pull situation. Now, underneath this tree, we do have more of that darker paint. And we have that darker shadow happening. And we're going to get that in now. Again, starting that, we're not nearly as dark as we need to be, but it gives us a way to move forward as we slowly build those darks. And then this line's a little bit more like that. Now there's a little bit of that green across what we know is a road. And I'm going to actually just leave that light area under the tree in that green right now. And I'm going to come in, I'm going to now add a medium tone of a brown using a burnt umber in that area underneath the tree that we see as the other side of the street. So taking some of our burnt umber and our French ultramarine, we begin to start like putting together that dark and that forest color. So I'm going to begin to build some of those darks. Behind that tree. And while I do that, I'm going to bear in mind that this trunk of the tree is also quite dark, and we begin to see some of that dark coming up like this. I'm not going to wait too long to begin to get that down on my page. We're going to need to come back later and reinforce that, but right now we're just building those shapes. And in the spirit of building, I'm going to put in some of our fence. But again, we're laying in shapes now to begin building for the next step. Got everything quite warm now on those trunks, but I like that. I think that warm dark is working well for us. So as we are laying in these dark colors beneath the trees, we're setting up our next step of the painting. We will be coming back to these areas because there's a lot of darkness in there that we're going to have to capture. But we do also now want to begin to work up above the cherry trees because there are some areas we need to capture there before we move too far in the painting. I'm going to use the same mix of colors. And at this point, I'm going to switch back to my other brush to go back into the burnt sienna French ultramarine mix. Another thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to reach in, I'm going to get a little bit more of my ultramarine blue. I'm going to blue it a little more. I'm going to cool it because shapes and colors that are close to the ground and close to us tend to be warmer, like the area that we see underneath the cherry tree. What's above the cherry trees is a little cooler, so we bring in some blues. Now we're going to work in just some of those shapes so that we can keep that idea that we have some trees up here. You know, when you're doing forest and trees, you want to make sure that you're varying the width of your branches and the shape. Now most of these are going up. I'm going to work through some of these. And these are actually, they're going to be fairly light once we get to it. Let's do a big jump there. And let's put a stronger shape here, just to give some variety. Doing this painting is always like a dance in the sense of working through the shapes. Now I'm getting to an area where we have a lot more happening behind the trees than just above. So I'm going to grab a little more. There's a little bit of pink back here, and I'm going to reinforce that. A little bit up in here. As we just lay in all of these interesting shapes. Now I am moving over to the area where we're going to have open sky, so I do want to be mindful of that. And I'm not going to draw too many shapes up in there. Use a little bit of, reinforce some of that pink here in the forest beyond us. And really just begin to a little bit of that right there. Again, as we continue to build that texture. Now I'm going to use my brush to soften some of these lower areas of the forest, because as we see it, really is pretty soft. So we want to hold on to some of that texture, but still begin to push that forest back behind us by having some softness as well. And that will set the stage to come back in as it begins to dry, and then decide, do we want to put more detail in there or not? And as I do that, I'm going to go around these edges of the cherry blossoms and try to keep those interesting shapes. Coming in and blending some of those edges, softening them, I think is very helpful, because it helps us to see that there's really an atmospheric feeling happening in spring. In the spring, there's a looseness and a lightness of color. And we want to soften that and let those trees in the background fall back while we begin to build the rest of the painting. Now, my next thing that I do at this point, I've covered the entire painting, and so I can begin to refine the composition. I like working this way by using lighter colors, medium colors, and big shapes to start a painting. You can work this way if you are a very tight painter and you want a very detailed finished product, or a very loose painter. A very loose painter might look at this and say, hey, I'm finished, or I'm 90% finished. If you're a tight painter, you'd realize that you have weeks of work potentially on this. But when you start by laying all your colors into your painting and your shapes, you set up a color harmony, because you're using your colors across the painting. You're not putting in a blue sky here while you're painting a pink flower here. You're laying all your colors all across the painting, and it gives it a certain amount of harmony. So now as I look at this, I step back a bit and I begin to look at my big shape of the flowers. And I can see that I'm going to need to break those up a little bit more, and I can see that I'm going to want to put some of our branches in there. Since I'm going to move to the flowers, I'm going to take a moment and do something that painters love to do, to give themselves a little bit of a break and to reset their work. I'm going to clean my brushes. Very important. I'm going to use these two brushes going forward, so nice and clean. And I'm going to do the cleaning of my palette. Now, as a part, if you're painting at home, this is something you want to do periodically. I still do have some lovely paints on here, and but it's a time where I really do need to come in and reset. It's really important to periodically clean your palette. Painters reflexively do this when they're done. and also very important to clean your brushes. Now, I'm going to work with a somewhat smaller, I'm going to work with these two brushes. As I rinse and then dry my brush a little bit, I'm very careful of the tip. We want to keep our tips of our brushes nice and sharp. And I'm going to look at my whole painting. Now, what I'm seeing here is I do want to break out some of our trees. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose, we have two trees here, I'm going to choose to push this one back a little bit. This is where a glaze comes in very handy. And I'm going to use cerulean blue with a little bit of French ultramarine blue, just to really push back almost all of that tree, to give a little separation between the two trees. And a little bit of shadow. Just a soft line, just to push that back somewhat. Another change I'm going to make is I'm going to, now that I've pushed that back a little bit, I'm going to use the smaller brush and I'm going to cool off some of the areas under the trees and continue to darken them a bit. This is another point where we can use a glaze of blue. I'm going to bring in again a little bit of that burnt umber, but mostly blue. And what I'm going to do is I want to keep some of our texture here, bearing in mind that I need this to look like the forest behind, but I'm also going to organize it a little more. By cooling, by adding a little bit of blue, adjusting that color temperature, and grabbing just a teeniest bit of green to put back there, I can begin to make that area look a bit more realistic as I push it back. And it's a whole kind of push and pull that we have with color and temperature. Now, right now we're working on our dark, dark values. So we've moved from large space, light value, to smaller space, darker values. Most of us, as we paint, do not really capture those values as well as we can. And that's letting us really try to capture those. I also like to pull myself way back from my painting as I look at it. Most of us work really closely with our paintings right in front of us, and I want to suggest that it's a great idea to get back from that. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to continue to pull in the shapes of that fence, because I think that really does add a lot of interest to this composition. And I'm going to put a little blue on that. And that fence really does continue through here. I'm going to come in, I'm going to put a little bit of shadow into the foreground. Just a little bit of interest to pull that eye in. I'm following our line that we set up earlier. And I'm going to come and reinforce some of this dark in here on this edge of the tree. I'm working with some of these little pointy shapes there, little dots, to try to reinforce that we've got some interesting little shapes happening at the edge of this cherry tree. And I move from, you can see, the wetter paint to the drier paint, especially now as I'm coming back in over some areas of the painting that are probably still a little bit wet. And that pushes back fairly nicely. I'm going to work a little bit on the background of the trees. And again, we're keeping this really pretty light, but we're going to come back to our glaze. And I'm going to glaze a few portions of this in blue. The glaze helps to pull the trees together and push them back. So we're pushing them back from the important part of our painting, which are the blossoms. I'm not going to glaze the whole background. We're still going to leave it pretty loose. We're going to leave that lovely bit of red right there. We are going to come in, we are going to sharpen up one area of the trees over here, just because I think it's incredibly interesting, this bit that comes up like this. Now, as our paper dries, we can do this. Now, those of you who have taken my classes know I would probably work a painting like this in a couple of hours increments. But this is super fun to do it this way. And we could always come back later and work on this some more. But I'm truly loving the way we're getting these incredible colors here. And as you notice, tree trunks are not always blue, always brown. I love to make them blue. And I'm going to come in, I'm going to actually blue up some of our trunk here because it's honestly just a little bit too brown. We always come to the question of when is a painting finished? And one of the things that I like to say is that we're really finished when we have a whole painting, a whole composition. And oftentimes, as we continue to work a painting, we recognize that there's the question of overworking that painting. So as I come in here and I try to put in sufficient amount of detail, to build interest in the painting, there's always that question of, are you going to put in too much? Or are you going to get just enough? And when it comes to trees, I do like having that feeling that you've got a lot of interest in your branches, but not so much that from a distance you're just seeing branches. In this tree that's behind us, it's going to help us to push that tree back. Because as you work your painting, you're going to realize that you don't really need to copy that photo in front of you or even that landscape in front of you. What you need to do is interpret it. Part of my interpretation here is to continue pushing this second tree back and softening some of these edges to get ourselves to a nice soft tree and put our emphasis here. I like to come in with a very hard brush. This is not a watercolor brush, and I clean some things up. One thing I'm not liking right now here are these two shapes. I think they're distracting, and I think they need to be connected. So I use this brush to lift a little bit of those shapes and to begin to clean a little, break them up a little bit. Let's completely lift off this little bit there. Let's scrub this little bit here. And I use a clean bit of paper towel. Do that. It's really how you finish a painting. You evaluate, did you do what you wanted to do, and now where are the remaining problems? And that's definitely, those little shapes are problems. These in here I like. I think they add to the composition. This little tail here now. And I'm going to use this bit here. I'm going to push that back just a teeny bit with blue. See, cool colors, blues, move away from you. Warm colors, move toward you. And I want to lift up some of that clean, because I don't want to overwhelm the painting, but I do want to push it back. And I think the very last thing I'm going to do is just, again, some softening down through here. And I'm going to use this very hard brush to do that, because I do want to keep the idea that we have a horizontal line here, but I don't really, I think right now it's a little raggedy, a little too raggedy. I think it's overwhelming the painting a bit. I'm going to soften that. I'm going to lift out a little piece here, a little bit of light. I'm going to lift out a tiny bit of light right here. And let's take a little bit of that up into the tree. So I think there are a few additional things you could do with the painting, but at this point we've got a full composition. We have a foreground, we have a middle ground, we have a center of interest, and we have a background that's pushed away. I think we've gone ahead and we've captured the beautiful cherry blossoms of spring, and I encourage you to go out and capture a few of them yourself.